Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture video for week 5. Today we'll be looking at high poly modeling. Don't worry about the image on the left here, that is just some reference that I'm going to model a bit as we go. I'm not expecting you to suddenly go from low poly modeling straight to the entirety of Frostmourne. So each 3D artist will have their own sort of favorite part of the process. For me, I really enjoy the high polygon modeling phase. The reason I've got this over here on the side, I tend to prefer how Blender used to do reference images as opposed to the sort of the method we looked at in week 2. So I won't be able to trace directly onto this, but it's it's there and it's in the file if I need to make reference to it. So if I just make a start, add a cylinder, being high poly modeling, we don't need to worry about the polygon count pretty much at all until your computer starts to break. So if we were doing this as a low poly mesh for the cylinder, we would generally want to come down here, change the amount of vertices to be lower. We might still do that for reasons I will get to in a second. But yeah, generally we don't need to worry too much about the polygon count. So once again, turn on screencast keys, make sure that's active, go to view, viewport clipping, because that happens every single time, 0.01. So things like the viewport clipping defaults, because I keep coming back to them, for Blender, if I was just working personally on projects and not recording for people who are using Blender for the first time, things like this that I have to keep changing, I would change them and do File, change that, Edit, Preferences, Save Preferences to change anything that I'd done and make that the default for add-ons that I would always have going, and then File, Defaults, Save Startup File. So any changes you would make would then load every single time, so I wouldn't have to keep changing the viewport clipping. Why I'm not doing that is because every time I record a video, I want to make sure it's in the stock version of Blender 2.8, 2.83 LTS specifically, so that when it comes time to record these videos, and if I'd ironed all this out before I started and saved my defaults, every time someone who's watching one of these videos loads Blender, they're going to start to run into small issues here or there that need tweaking, and I want to make sure that I cover those in the video as they come up. So that's sort of why I keep coming back and doing this every time rather than just setting it once. However, we will get back to our model here. So again, just getting the basic scale of our mesh. Item scale 1. So currently it's a 2-meter sword. 2-meter swords do exist, but not super common. So if we were to scale that, and again, don't necessarily worry about following along in this video. This is more just an example so that I can get a little bit done and talk about things as I go. So that would be our sort of handle there. That looks a reasonable sort of a size. 5cm wide grip is still pretty chunky, but we'll go with that. Control A, apply the scale. So subdivision modeling, or high poly modeling, often referred to as two parts of the same thing. If we go to our modifier panel, which is this spanner on the side here, get that out of the way, add subdivision surface. So that has done a couple of things to my cylinder. It has taken each quad and divided it into 4 quads, which we do add mesh cube, add modifier, subdivision surface. So each quad becomes 4 quads. If we take that up a notch, 1 quad now becomes 4 by 4, so 16, and so on and so forth. This has rather a smoothing effect on all sorts of meshes. in the viewport, I tend to leave that at 2 and continue the modeling from there. So this quality setting they've added in more recent versions of Blender. Just leave that as the default and we'll sort of carry on from there. So if I was to go back into edit mode, we get our original cylinder back. We'll just sort of delete that UV map because that's going to keep getting in the way of my reference image. That one, that one, that one. Cool. So in edit mode, we get our original cylinder back. If we were to turn on this 4th tab up the top of our modifiers, that then shows the actual modifier in use in edit mode. This can be handy. I tend to switch between them a little bit, but usually leave it off. So the process of subdivision modeling includes a lot of the following. So if we were to do Control R to cut in an edge loop, drag it up the top here. So it is still subdividing these faces, but because there is now a second loop, and if we were to do a third, that is now subdividing, but because there are more loops in that spot, it's subdividing more along this edge than it is going down, and that is one way to transition between two surfaces, but have that be a sharper crease. Because if we were to grab the bottom face here, extrude that out, scale it, as we sort of start to play with the various shapes, each time we do the iterations of how many times it's subdividing it, it'll smooth between all these forms. So the way to get your sharper edges back between the transitions is, again, to either add an extra loop or two. But the other way of doing it, and we'll select the edges going up this way, Control E, and then edge crease. So as we drag the mouse along the screen, what you'll see it is doing there is making a sharper crease along these edges, which tells the subdivision modifier, and again we've got use creases turned on, to take these edges and make them sharp. Occasionally the smoothed mesh will go over the top of the cage or low poly mesh. So if we go to wireframe, we'll be able to see bit of a funky view, but you'll get used to this. If we do, again, Control E, edge crease, that will bring that smoothing in much closer to the actual, if this is set to 1, this will be maintained a sharp edge. So back in solid mode, we've now got our sharp edge down the side of the cylinder and a sharp crease at the base of it. However, because there's no creases on the edges going down in the vertical, this then becomes really a smooth sort of shape. And to be fair, that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of subdivision modeling. Obviously I'll cover more examples and flesh it out from here, but you create a lower poly mesh, you add this subdivision modifier to it, that smooths things out and adds a whole lot more polygons, and then if you want edges to become sharper, you either add the creases back in, or it can be very handy to just add loops like that. Adding the loops as opposed to just the creases lets you also do things like if you're wanting to move that in, so Alt-S will scale along the normals, or effectively fatten a mesh out or shrink it back in. So because we did that with cut loops instead of edge creases, that will now, we can start to transition much more complex shapes than we were doing with our just simple low poly meshes before for the actual in-game mesh. So creases can be handy. They keep the polygon count a little more under control. I tend to favor adding in the extra edge loops. Again, because this is our high poly mesh, there's sort of, you can do either because the polygon count doesn't really matter. But yes, they are both valid options for getting to the final shape that you want. And that is really the goal here, is to use whatever tools you can and whatever poly count you need, whether you're adding in some sculpted elements, to get as much of that smooth detail that we can then bake into a texture for the normal map, ambient occlusion map, and the other maps that we looked at last week. So obviously I'm not going to just leave it at that and say, okay, now you know subdivision modeling, go ahead. What we're going to do is use the sword here from Warcraft 3, if you're not familiar, and actually get some practical example in. So again, mesh, cylinder, that's going to have the sort of lower count we had before. Scale 0.1, move up. Transforms, so 0.2 of a meter, so more on that 0.05, and the grip of the handle, let's say that was 0.35 or so. Apply scale. So if you missed it in the video I did for recapping the practical in week 3, applying the scale helps tools like bevel to act as you would imagine them to. So again, we'll just save that, add modifier, subdivision surface, viewport of 2, 3 even, and use creases. So looking at our image, we'll start with the part of the handle and sort of work our way down. Go to the mesh tab, delete that. Right, so first of all, add a bit of a seam in there, we'll notice that there's these bands that go around. So what we can do, split in a couple more segments that way. Now this can be done numerically, or we can just sort of eyeball it, depending on what it is. This section here, sort of about 1.4. Scale along the axis, 1.4. And we'll notice that those are a bit out, so we'll just make this center bit a bit bigger. So with the faces selected, those two rounds there, we can E for extrude, scale them in along those normals, and we can see that we've got all these sort of softer parts. So if we were to E to extrude again and scale in a little bit further, this gives us our second edge crease. So just to turn that on again, we've now got the one edge in there, one edge in there. Generally, to keep something specifically quite sharp, you'll need a total of 3 edges. So one to sort of stop the transition going that direction, another one for that direction, and another one for the edge itself. As I sort of run around and do this to other parts of the mesh, that'll become a bit clearer. But we've got our sort of 3 more solid parts, and then the recessed bits is where we'll put our sort of softer leather sort of straps. Now, with these here, again, just put it back into the cage mode. That has not been done particularly evenly, so I move that closer. Instead of moving directly along the axis, a reminder that you can do edge edge slide, which effectively does the same thing, but when we get to other sections like this part of the blade, that'll become more obvious as to why that's sort of useful. But for now, select that, select that, select that, extrude to get our extra edge loops in, scale that to 0.8, just using numerically the number pad there. That one, extrude again, Alt S to scale in. Now with our example image, that looks like it's more of a harder edge, but I kind of like the softer transition a bit. So if I was to put in multiple edge loops and scale those so it's a little bit fatter, I actually like the taper going in slightly on all of those parts. Cut in 3 loops, Alt S, in, 3 loops, Alt S, in. You can also just get a lot of detailing for sort of shapes like this done if you zoom in real quick, cut in a whole bunch of loops. You know, these are going to be sort of bigger again, so scale those out, repeat the same process, scale those out, have a bit of a sharper transition here, sharper transition here. The speed at which Blender allows you to do this sort of stuff and just cut in the loops with the Control R and the mouse wheel really comes into its own. So different pieces of software do this particular step slightly differently. Maya and any other particular piece of software might also have add-ons that let you sort of do other things, like have the topology curve up in a screw if you were sort of modeling like screws and bolts and things. But yes, just simply being able to go into the mesh, define I need these loops, I need them to be that scale, down that way, scaled out, is really, really efficient. Which is part of the reason why I love this process. Also, it's arguably slightly less technical than the low poly modeling phase, because you don't need to keep an eye on the poly count, which again is down the bottom right of the screen. You just jump in and model exactly what needs doing. So for the leather handle parts, if I select these, Shift D will duplicate part of the mesh, right click to just cancel the movement, E will extract that out, Alt S to fatten it. So if we just go in wireframe view here, and Control Plus will grow or shrink the selection, what we've got is a sort of a cylinder shape, or a torus even, because it's got the hollowed center, so it'd be more of a obvious donut if we scaled it down. What we can do here is P by selection. That makes that a separate part of the mesh. So from here we could take this and sort of sculpt on parts of the leather, but what I'm going to do is go back into edit mode, select all, scale that down, again go to edges, cut in a few more loops, Alt S, scale those in so we've got a bit of the slightly fatter edge and yeah, thinner in the center. Cut in more loops yet again. And then deliberately start to mess these around a bit. So yeah, this could be a sculpted part of the process. You could also use displacement maps, which if I remember, I'll come back to at another point, and just get a little bit of a feeling of the surface of this part of the mesh. Again, we can also paint this into the normal map or the bump map later on, but with the high poly modeling phase, if you start to get some of that detail into the model and bake it down, It gives us a lot of flexibility with what we can do later on. And it also adds a certain level of believability to especially the normal map, but also the ambient occlusion and any of the other bakes we might be doing. So that's not super accurate for leather, but it does give us a bit of the surface direction of that. What I can do now is Shift D on that object, constrain that to the axis, and just start to add multiple cloth strips. Because they're repeated, they're going to look pretty boring, but if I was to go in here, proportional editing tool. So bit of a segue, but soft selection or proportional editing, which we briefly looked at in the initial modeling videos, becomes a lot handier in the high poly modeling phase. So it can be handy a little bit for the low poly modeling, but if we were to just zoom out here, we'll get that very large radius, which defaults to about 2 meters, but if we scale it in with the mouse wheel, get back closer into our mesh, move that around. So especially for organic shapes, like a strip of material, which we're editing now, we can now grab parts of the mesh and just sort of start to nudge them around. So again, because poly count is not an issue, we have as many polys as we need to work with. This can be a very handy way of adding some irregularity to the surface, which will break it up and make it look less immediately computer graphics or fake, and just start adding to a little bit of the randomness or the surface quality of this object. And again, if this was a low poly cylinder for our actual in-game mesh, once we start to add this detail in, this will all bake directly into the normal map and show up in-game as having this kind of a surface quality to it. Just take these there, Shift D to duplicate, rotate them around a bit so we're not getting the copy-paste look. Can then go back in, make some more changes as well, just to break it up a bit further. Again, I'm going through this fairly quickly. We'll also notice that these straps are probably in a bit thin for what this is. So if we were to select all these, Control J will join them. So that is now one mesh again. We can scale that up, move that down, scale it in just the one axis, and that might be fitting a bit better there. Alternatively, if we were to join these, go into edit mode, select all, Alt S, which again is that shrink or fatten that we looked at briefly earlier, and we can uniformly add thickness to that. So that would be probably a bit too extreme. That's suddenly starting to look like soft serve ice cream or something. But a little combination of the two. So if we fatten it slightly and then scale it down. So again, we get, in my opinion anyway, proportional editing can also be changed to whether it's connected or not. So this will say this is part of the one connected shape, so I'm only affecting this one. Drag that down a bit there to fill the gap. What I was saying just then is in terms of the flexibility, because we're not thinking about poly counts at all, we can just quickly add on more and more detail and keep going. Topology is important because, again, the edge flows help us to do selections and keep the mesh relatively clean when it's got the smoothing of the subdivision surface on it. But yes, it's more about making sure that we're getting the shapes that we want so we can bake all this surface detail into what would be a far simpler cylinder, and then use that texture on the cylinder in Unreal to show the final surface quality of the mesh that we're after. So, cylinder, good place to start, good place to show a few things. Obviously not everything to do with high poly modeling is simply taking a cylinder, adding more edge loops and scaling them around, which is pretty much what we've done so far. So if we were to go to the front view in orthographic, just numpad 1, again, with the practical we'll be having some more specific exercises, so this is more just for me to show things as we go along and the direction that this is kind of heading. We'll start on the actual blade itself. So if I was to just sort of create a new mesh, shift mesh plane, we enter into edit mode. We don't need any of these verts. Delete vertices, go to vertex mode, back into orthographic. And now effectively what we've got is a empty object called plane, and we're in edit mode. So if I was to control right click, that will add an individual vertex. If I E to extrude, that'll extrude a single vertex. Again, this is sort of recapping some basics from the modeling we've looked at already, but that's mostly been extruding in and out of faces. We can also do similar things with the vertices. So what I'm going to do here, F will make them a face, but move them down, turn proportional editing off, and just sort of get the basic shape of that initial part of the blade. Moving some individual ones to maintain the curve a bit better. So if you missed a spot, you can also keep hitting the W key because that's what it used to be. If you right click, subdivide, you can add more verts into a particular section there. So get that curve back up. Again, subdivide, subdivide. Going to shift select these two and merge vertices because I don't need both of them. So that's probably enough of the blade on that side, and just to finish things off, extrude both of these. Scale both vertices in the x-axis to 0, and with the up the top here 0 to make them snap to the central part of the screen, the center part of the axes, and then we can do F to join two vertices. So that won't make a face, but that'll connect two vertices. So now we've got our full sort of shape here. Bring that curve to make it a bit nicer. Alt left click will select the whole loop, and F will make a face. So again, everything I've been saying about n-gons, this has created one gigantic n-gon with a whole lot of different edges to it. We are not going to leave it as an n-gon, but for a starting point, this will help with our modeling of the blade. So a tool that I may have glossed over a little bit earlier, but will become handier for what we need now, is the inset tool. So if I was to click I, what that is doing is that is creating a uniform edge loop around loop of faces around the edge of what we have selected, and insetting that n-gon into the center. So where we're getting the flickering and the faces popping up is in the corners where you can see some of the vertices are starting to overlap back over themselves. Blender is doing its best to try and figure that shape out, but what we do is if we get that to around the right width that it is in the image, just sort of around like that will do for now. What we can do is go back to these vertices and just tweak them to how they should be, more or less. Particularly with this corner here, because that's about the worst of it. This n-gon will continue to flicker in and out. We can just leave that for now. Up the top here, that gets a little bit narrower. I think I've sort of, because of the darkness of the image, missed a couple of bits. So grab that in the z-axis, move that up so we've got a bit more of a space going through there. And then of course that is the outer, that's the inner, so moving these back here. So this being the center, we actually want that to be flat. So what we can do here is go to faces, delete that face, select this edge, zero that out so that is in the center there, and also just keeping an eye on that vertex so it doesn't get the really long thin part, because that won't behave how we want it to. So this is all still flat, but we now have our loop of edges and loop of faces going around. So what we can do now is select that single face, grab that, constrain it to the y-axis to bring it out, and we've started to get the basic shape of that part of the blade. Now I know it's not mirrored, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we will do mirror. We'll keep that mirrored in X. We'll mirror that in Y. So again, just to show that, that'll mirror it back that way. And then to carry on with our high poly subdivision surface demonstration, we will add a subdivision surface to it. So that has immediately changed the shape. Again, it's trying to smooth things out. It's having issues with those large n-gons in the center, but we will go back and tweak that to make it behave how we want it to. So with the viewport settings, just bump that up to 3, save this. So if we go in edit mode, we've still got our n-gon there. It's on the front and the back. If we were to hit I for inset a second time and drag it in ever so slightly, so we've got, zooming in here, a really thin loop of edges. Again, because poly count is not an issue, we can have that as thin as we need it. That has started to sharpen up, especially on this top edge, to get that edge of the blade that we want. The other thing this has done, because we've got the mirror modifier and then the subdivision surface modifier, it's created this thin edge in the center, which has got the mesh deforming in a way we don't really want. So we'll just undo that for now. Make sure we're in edit mode still. Clipping is part of the mirror modifier, and what that will do is if we were to then I for inset again, of course the one time I want to use clipping, it doesn't work with the insert tool. The general idea behind clipping is if it's turned on, it'll snap anything to the center. If you extrude, it won't put an inner edge. But of course with the inset tool it seems to put one in anyway. That's alright, we'll leave clipping on. What we can do here with this face is if we grab the face and move it into the center, it'll be constrained and squished to infinitely thin. We can then delete that face, and so now our inset will follow around nicely how we want it. However, because we can see some of the faces still skewing everywhere, that that will still need further work. For now, we will just go to edges. We will add in another cut towards that edge there, slide it along. We'll add another cut, slide it along this edge here. So that way we're getting our sharper edges. And then just to check this face, and Control plus to get that little edge around, scale Y, should make it sure it's flat in the y-axis because that's how we want it. Save. So with this n-gon here, we are eventually going to need to turn that into specific faces. What we'll do first though, and again just ignore this big jutting out part, E for extrude, and if we bring that back in the y-axis, that will start to give us our interior shape, which is the darker part of this metal here. Now, because of the way the smoothing is working, you'll start to notice some of these stretch lines here, and that is again because this n-gon is technically still a whole group of triangles. Those triangles have diagonal edges to them, and that is causing some of the odd sort of stretching. So if we go into our wireframe view, you'll see that the edges of the blade are starting to look how we want them, but this large n-gon is time to deal with that basically. So the quickest way to do that is Control T, which will triangulate everything. So again, if we go back to wireframe, so it's taken that n-gon and it's split it up into triangles for us. So we can then go back and make this even sort of cleaner shape. Another way to sort of deal with that would be to delete the n-gon, keep these edges that we've got here, and just start to select that edge there, F for face, that edge there, F for face, and connect the sort of various areas manually. This is the cleanest way to do it. It's arguably the more time-consuming way to do it. But, you know, once you get the hang of the shortcuts, it's not too bad. So we'll just continue on doing it the proper way. Extrude that. Again, with the clipping on, that will snap everything to the center axis when we get there. F for face, face. Now, this is a small face down here and a larger face there. So if we were to do F for face there, that is technically an n-gon. So we'll want to make sure we grab in wireframe mode the little edge there, the little edge there, F for face, and then the larger one, which we can alt select as the edge loop there. For this end here, I'm basically just going to cheat, Control T, triangulate it. If you have a group of triangles and you hit Alt J, what that will do is try and take as many triangles as it can and force them back into being quads. So it's found a quad there, it's found a quad there, and it's still left a few triangles. It's also given us a quad on the end there. Again, this is not going to end up as our actual in-game mesh. So topology is important and it's relatively clean now. However, we don't need to get rid of absolutely every single triangle because this won't end up in the game engine anyway. So we want this surface to be flat on the interior. So if we go to one of these edges extruding out the side, Control R to cut in our edge loop, click to assign which edge we want it to, and drag it back down to keep this interior flat. We've now pretty much eliminated all the sort of weird stretching that was going on in the interior, and we have removed that n-gon, and we are starting to look like how we want to. The next sort of spot would be to get these points. couple of options here. We can Alt-click that edge loop, and we can bevel it. Control B will give us our bevel. Shift will slow down the rate at which it is beveling, and just make it easier for finer controls. So instead of using the Control R to cut an edge loop in, which would still work, this has taken our one edge loop along that edge and split it in two. Or if we go to our bevel section here to make it really quite sharp, segments of 2. So now we have our really fine sort of point on the edge of the blade there. Just sort of repeat that by Alt-select that loop there, Alt-select that loop there, Alt-select that loop there, and just for the interior of the sword, selecting that one there. Now that has gone down into the center of the mesh, so we'll just remove that part of our selection, and once again, Control B to bevel. That's remembered our previous setting and cut the 3 loops, and that would give us our sharper edges there. We would then also sort of continue down the blade, and away we go. So I am not going to model the entirety of this sword, but that is sort of the general process for how I'd go about creating other shapes as well. So you get the initial sort of form down, you get in some of the key face loops, which we did for the side sort of parts of the blade. You then remove any sort of n-gons, and then you start to add back in your loops, whether it's edge loops or bevels or setting the creases, which we did earlier in the video. Now that we're sort of at this point with the blade, something else we can do is we can adjust the sort of fall off shape of that. If we were to cut 2 more loops in here, because that is a straight edge, it's not going to do anything immediately. However, if we're to do Alt-S, we can now bring that into a bit of a taper. So we have to be careful here because we've already done the beveling. These sort of curve back out on themselves. However, they get smoothed out a little bit with the actual subdivision surface modifier, so it's not caused any real issues except a little bit of pinching up here. So if we were to just undo a few steps, undo this bevel on the edge here, and do this section first, then do the beveling of these edges second, or better yet, an alternate way of doing that is the crease which we mentioned before. And removing that one. So again, there's different use cases for whether you would use crease or bevel or cutting a different edge loop. Whatever makes it easier on yourself for that particular part of the mesh. So we'll do a right click, edge crease. We get our bright pink signifiers of these are creased edges. And if we go back into object mode out of edit mode, we'll see we're starting to get somewhere with the shape of this blade for sure. So, I mean, so that is the basics of how to sort of block in those edges and add progressive detail and smoothness to a shape like that. This technique and variations of it are how you would create most objects in a high poly sort of a sense. So whether that is, you know, a curved but carved blade, softer objects, hard surface objects, a mix between the two. So, you know, like an axe might have the softer wooden part, which you would then possibly go in and add some sculpting or the texture to the handle, and then have that transition, whether it's through bits being bolted on or adjusted and and fused into the different materials. Generally, where possible, it'll be easier on yourself if you have separate materials for each object. So if you had the objects split up into, this is going to be polished metal, this is going to be sort of, the more grungy basic metal, this is going to be the leather, because then it's really a simple matter of adding, and just to show it different in the viewport, adding your different materials. Control L will link. You can link object data, or in this case material data, going the other direction, of course. So the last object, the brighter orange being the active object, control link materials. So these now have the same material, so if you change it on one, it changes on both. Keeping things split up that way makes it easier to manage your scene, manage the different components, and of course keep things clean when it comes to baking textures from one to the other. So to wrap up for this particular example, we'll take a look at this skull shape here and how I would sort of tackle that. So again, front view, Shift A, mesh plane. That'll add a plane to the base. We don't need any of these vertices. Back to the front view. Model quite small, so control right click again to add a vertice. We'll make a bit of a loop for the eye socket. Shift left click that, F to join them. Select all. Still got soft selection on, turn that off, scale that out. Move that as such. Add modifier mirror, add modifier subdivision surface, and turn that up one. So with any sort of character, the eye sockets are usually the easiest to start with. Extrude that in. Extrude those up. Again, want clipping turned on because that will help us. So now we have a loop going around the top of the eye socket. At the moment that is obviously flat. So if we select these two, turn the soft selection back on, G for grab, Y for the Y-axis, and just move that out, we'll start to get a bit of a curve to the skull shape. So select all those, uniformly bring them back in a bit. Now the snapping at the center, being quite a small object, we probably want to set this merge limit down even less. If this does happen to you and you get something snapped in the center that you didn't want to be merged, you can turn clipping off, select the vertex, and just bring it back out again. Be sure to turn clipping on afterwards, as it'll make sure that center seam is taken care of. So again, if we go into the wireframe view, we can see that whole loop is selected by the Alt left click. Drag in part of the socket, extrude, scale in, and fill in the faces. Back to solid mode. There's a bit of a heavier brow, or where the brow would be, but had eyebrows. Add an extra loop in there, so we've got a few more polys to play with. Bring that in. Extrude that out, and we bring that back in. That can start to be where the cheekbone mean, it's a skull, so it's all the same piece of bone, but where that form will sort of start. Rotating that on the z-axis. It's starting to get somewhere here. Something you'll notice to do with the normals of the object. So I'm getting a bit of a definite edge along here. That can mean a few things, but usually it means the normals are not in a unified direction. So again, to show the viewport normals, we go to viewport overlays and face orientation. We can see that the red is painting the red faces are pointing a different direction to the blue ones. So to fix that, we go to face, mesh, normals, recalculate outside. That is the quick way to just, if you know the surface is continuous but the normals aren't necessarily facing all the right way, that is the quick way to fix that. From then on we should be good, so we can turn that back off. Extrude that again. Now, alt selecting an edge loop is going all the way up the top, which we don't want. We actually just want to make an edge loop out of this. Extrude that, scale it in a bit, bring it back in that direction, and we can then close that off. Getting a little triangle in here, but that's all right. Again, an example of the smoothing. This comes out to quite a point, but you know, once it's smoothed back in, that's fine. Because the high-res mesh, the end result is what we're after. This being kind of jagged doesn't particularly matter because that's going to get smoothed out, and this will be the resulting mesh that's getting baked onto the low-res for the normals anyway. Start to even out the size of those faces a bit. Scale along the z-axis. Move those back in the Y. Add another loop in here. Now we can bring this loop forward a bit to sort of help with the curve of the skull. Now we don't need to see the back of this because, you know, that would be sort of a waste of modeling, because anything we sort of detail on the back is going to be set within the top of this sort of pommel. scale that in the Y direction just to make sure we've got some detail going back. Turn soft selection back on temporarily. Move that up to get a bit more rounded. Gonna cut an extra edge loop through here, which means we can grab these two, turn soft selection off, move them back, grab these, bring them out to help give us that sort of the ridge. This vertex in particular also needs to go back. There we go. Now the teeth. I think what we'll do is select that edge, that one and that one. Edge, bevel edges. And if we bring that up and add in an extra segment, what we can do now is bring these up. And to make that a bit more uniform, select these faces here and bring them in. Just about done with this for the purposes of showing and how I'd sort of tackle that kind of a shape. Right, so might tweak that a bit further to make certain edges more pronounced, and that should be much more of a indent. Right, that'll do for now. Save the progress. So, within the context of the rest of our sword, these would sit up here. If I was to scale that down a bit, Control A, apply rotation and scale. So if I was to Shift D, duplicate that, we can then specify up here, that would be minus that location. Nope, wrong axis. Adjust that in the Y direction, of course. Rotate Z-axis 180. Shift D for both of these. Rotate Z-axis 90. So at the moment these are all individual, so if I was to go into one, it would change one mesh. However, if we shift select all of these, Control L, which I believe I've mentioned briefly, but we'll look at again, object data. So now we have four meshes with four objects with a linked mesh. This is sort of what we discussed of the object properties here and then the mesh properties here. You can see there is a number 4, meaning there are 4 users of this particular mesh, which we shall call skull mesh, and the object would be skull 01 and 02, 3, 4 as we go. Should have done the naming before we duplicated that, and as you can tell, I would need to go back and rename all the different components of my mesh as we're going along to keep things nice and clean. But now that these are linked, what we can do is edit 1 and all of them will follow. So this is where instancing can come really quite in handy for details like this, and obviously on the sort of high resolution mesh, we could have, you know, multiple different skulls, or if we wanted like a specific insignia that was into every button or rivet, you would be able to keep things sort of unified that way. Again, Alt-S to scale or shrink along the normal. That's more of a pointed edge there. And a bit of a smoother top. So yes, slightly different on the horns, but basically just to show that for the instancing, this would come in a bit like that, and there's also a bit of a socket on each of these. So if we shift select those, E for extrude, Alt-S to scale in slightly, E to extrude, Alt-S to scale in again, and to make that sort of sharper along there, sharper along there, cool. So that is going to do it for the video lecture for this week. Obviously we'll cover a specific example object or two in the practical, yes, this will not be the only video where we cover subdivision surface techniques, but it is the main one. So if you have any questions, be sure to let me know in the practical, or obviously external students via email. We will revisit this as we go with the other topics, but the sort of primary thing to sort of recap, block in your main edge loops first, and then get the overall sort of form working the same way you would if you were working on a low poly mesh. And then as you go with the subdivision modifier turned on, either add in extra edge loops or set the edge crease. Both are perfectly valid, depending on which is easier to tweak for that particular part of the model. Yeah, go from there. Thank you very much.